In this video, I'll be walking through the process of building an Ubuntu Linux server version 16.04 using VMware Fusion 10. There are a lot of reasons to use a virtual machine for a whole ton of different projects. Maybe I want to build a new web server, I want to figure out how to build some kind of server that I've never built before, or I just want to play around with configuration options before I deploy. I can use a virtual machine to avoid tying up physical hardware that maybe this installation is going to live on, or I might run it out of a virtual machine forever. What we'll do in this video is just create a general purpose server virtual machine that we can use for a variety of applications. Now, I happen to be using a Mac, but the same general steps should work with any operating system. We'll assume that we have VMware Fusion installed. But first we need to get our installation media. So let's open up a web browser and go to ubuntu.com. And once we get there, we can go ahead and click on the server button up here to get ourselves to the server downloads page. I'll head over and actually choose that we want to download Ubuntu Server. And we'll notice that the top option here is Ubuntu Server 16.04. Now, that's an earlier version than 17.10, obviously, but this LTS here means that it's the long-term service version, and so we're going to check that. That's what we're going to commonly use, is our long-term service versions. So we'll download that. That should start automatically. If it doesn't, we'll go ahead and click this link here to start it manually. But once that download completes, we'll move on to the next step. Now that my installation media has finished downloading, we'll go ahead and close out the browser, and we're going to start up VMware Fusion. So once that kicks off, it'll come up to our installation method screen, and this big option at the top is we're going to choose a disk or image to install our operating system from. So we'll just leave that selected and click on the button down here to move to the next step. We'll use this dialog to choose our installation image. So we'll just click this button here, and I've just left it in the downloads folder. So I'll navigate over to that and choose the installation media that I downloaded from ubuntu.com earlier. So we'll just go ahead and select that and move on. Now that shows up as the media we're going to use, so I'll click Continue. And that brings us up to an option to use something called Easy Install. Now, I am not a fan of this. This is just going to go through and sort of auto-install things with all the default options. But I'd like to take you through a step-by-step installation procedure as though you installed from a CD or DVD. So we'll unselect that option and continue from there. Now we have the option to choose either Legacy BIOS or UEFI. Now UEFI is the more kind of modern version. Most systems that you get these days are going to be enabled for that. So let's choose that and see what that looks like. And now we have our summary of how we're going to configure this thing. Now I'd like to give it a custom name, and you can also change a whole lot of these other options by customizing settings. So let's go ahead and choose that option and give it our own name and take a look at what other settings we can play with. Now once I've clicked that button, I'm going to go ahead and just name this something that makes sense to me. So let's call it Ubuntu Test Server. Once I've done that, our Ubuntu Test Server settings option box will come up, and I can do various things, like I can enable shared folders that will automatically share between my virtual machine and my host. I can go to the processors and memory option to choose how many cores my virtual machine will have access to. I can change the amount of memory that my virtual machine will be allowed to use. And these are just a couple of the options as far as what settings I can play with to give this virtual machine exactly the resources that I want it to have. But for right now, the only thing we've changed is the name. And once we've done that, we'll have this box here with this big play button. And when we click on that, we'll actually start our installation process. So let's go ahead and click that big play button, and we're booting the system. So the first thing that comes up is our installation options, or the options of what we can do off of our installation media. Now when we click on this, notice that the cursor disappears, and we're going to have to use the arrow keys. We're just on the keyboard when we do this installation. So we'll choose this first option here to just install Ubuntu on our virtual machine. Well, that'll start the installation process, and we'll just choose our various language and location options. Again, remember to use your up and down or right and left arrow keys and the enter key to go ahead and navigate through these dialogues. And it'll ask us if we want to detect our keyboard layout. Let's not do that. We'll just choose, in my case, the US English, but if you're somewhere else or you use a different language or keyboard layout, go ahead and choose the one appropriate to your installation. And then it'll do some stuff automatically. It'll keep us updated on what's going on, but soon enough, we'll get to some installation options that we have to actually choose ourselves. So periodically throughout this video, I'll fade in and out to just skip the longer stretches of automatic installation processes going on, and we'll just highlight the choices we have to make as we move along through the installation process. The first thing we'll choose is a host name to identify our server with. We'll just go ahead and change that, in this case, to Ubuntu Test Server, just like we called the virtual machine itself, but you can call this whatever you want. So if you have already chosen a host name for your virtual machine, feel free to use whatever you like. The next thing we'll do is create a user that will have administrative privileges, but that we'll use to log into the system rather than just logging in as the root user. That can be dangerous. And we also, from a security perspective, don't necessarily like to allow the root user to be able to be logged into remotely. So we'd ideally like to avoid using the root user at all. So Ubuntu gives us the option of creating a normal user with administrative privileges. And I'm just going to use my name for the full name. So I'll enter that here, and once I press enter, it will ask for a username for that user. It's going to autofill that with my first name, but we can change that to whatever we like as well. But I'm just going to go ahead and keep it as Jason. Then it will ask us for a password. Notice that we can actually use the arrow key and the space bar to choose to show the password, and we'll be able to see it in clear text. But I'm going to turn that off, and we'll enter the password that I'm actually going to use for this. Once I've done that, I can press enter, and it'll ask me to enter that again to make sure I've got it right. Now let's see what happens when we don't do the same thing. It'll give us this little error box. So once we see that, we can go back. We'll just press enter actually to continue, and we'll try entering our password twice again. And so if they match this time, we'll move on to the next step. The next thing we'll be asked about is whether or not we want to encrypt our home directory. Now, that can be very useful if we're going to have any information there that we might not want people to see. If someone gets access to our virtual machine, or if we end up installing Ubuntu on a physical server, if someone actually steals our physical computer, then they'd still have to crack through our password authentication to access anything in our home directory, because all of that would be encrypted. Now, there are a lot of times you might build a server where nothing will actually be installed in the home directory, so you could decide not to do this. But since the intention of this particular build is to experiment with some things, I may end up having log files or installation media or any of a plethora of other things that I do store in my home directory. So I'm going to go ahead and use the arrow key to highlight yes and press enter to go ahead and encrypt my home directory for this particular build. Next, it'll ask you to confirm your time zone. I do happen to be in the Eastern time zone in the US, so I'll just press enter to choose yes. If you're in a different time zone or it doesn't suggest the proper time zone, You can say no and choose your time zone from a list. The next thing we'll be asked about is how we want to partition our disk. Now, we could use manual and go ahead and set up our own partitions for our root and our home and our swap space. But in this case, we're going to just go ahead and make sure that use entire disk and set up LVM is selected here. And we'll just let the installer use a guided process to take care of that for us. We'll select the disk to partition, and we only have one virtual volume, so that's easy. We can just press enter here. And then it's going to ask us to confirm that we want to write the changes to the disk. This is where we're actually going to make some modifications. So we'll use our arrow key to select yes, and then when we press enter, it will actually start making changes to our virtual disk. It'll ask us how much of the volume should we allow it to use for guided partitioning. We're just going to let it use the whole thing. And then it's going to ask us if we want to force UEFI installation. We've made a couple small changes, so it thinks there might be a legacy system installed, so it's going to ask us to confirm that we do want to use UEFI. And since we chose that earlier, just like before, we'll choose yes, press enter, and move on from there. Again, we'll be asked to confirm one last time that we do want to make all of these changes that the installer has chosen for us. And again, we're going to kind of trust it in this case to partition things out properly. So we'll choose yes and press enter to let it actually partition out our virtual disk. And now it'll go through several minutes of automated installation. So we'll skip ahead to the next thing we have to actually do ourselves. The next thing we'll be asked about is whether we need a proxy server to connect to the internet. In this case, we don't, so we'll just move through that question. Then we'll be asked about what update policy we want to set. I usually like to leave it at no automatic updates because depending on what you're using, if you're using some kind of third-party software, a normal operating system update might actually break your server. So I like to not have it apply anything automatically so that I can test updates and make sure they're safe before applying them myself. Now, Ubuntu gives you the option of pre-installing various packages depending on what kind of server you want to set up. So you might install a LAMP stack if you want to do a web server, or you could pre-configure it to be a DNS server. In this case, we want a general server that we'll play around with ourselves. So let's just go all the way down to the bottom and select an Open SSH server. We'll want that so that we can have remote access to our system. So we'll let that set up a standard Open SSH server for us, although we could do that ourselves manually if we wanted to. We'll also leave the standard operating system packages selected as well. At that point, we'll have told the installer everything it needs to know to complete the installation, so it'll take several minutes to finish things up, and then we'll see what happens when we're actually done with the whole process, and we'll see what it looks like when our server is running. Once the installer is all finished, it'll show us this window to let us know that it's done doing what it needs to do. When we press enter to continue, our server will reboot and we'll get to watch the boot process, and eventually it'll come up to a login screen. From this screen, we can log in using the user that we set up during the installation process. In my case, that user's Jason, so I'll enter that as a username, type in the password I set, and we'll be logged into our server. The first thing we'll notice is that there are quite a few packages that can be updated, and a lot of those are security updates. So let's go ahead and, since we just have a general server, we haven't installed anything yet, let's go ahead and apply all of those updates right now, just to get things as updated as we can get them and make sure this is ready for us to go ahead and build something with. First, we'll use the sudo apt-get update command to update our repositories and make sure that we have all of the latest updates ready to apply. Once that's finished running, we'll use the sudo apt-get upgrade command to actually apply any pending updates. It's going to ask us if we want to continue and actually apply those updates after it tells us what it's going to update, what it will actually do to our system. And notice that there are two options, Y for yes or N for no, and the Y is capitalized, indicating that that's the default choice. So if you just pressed enter there, that would be like saying, yes, I want to apply my upgrades. So it'll go ahead and do its thing. If we choose no, though, if we type N and press enter, it'll abort the process. So let's clear our screen here and reissue the sudo apt-get upgrade command. But this time we'll go ahead and choose yes and actually go ahead and apply all of our updates. Now that we've applied our initial updates, let's take a look at another nice thing that we could do with virtual machines. So we'll clear the screen and enter the ifconfig command to take a look at our network setup. In this output, we can actually see the IP address that our virtual machine has. So we can actually open up a terminal from our host operating system and SSH into the virtual machine from a terminal on our host. Now when we do this, we'll just use the SSH command to SSH to our username that we set up, in my case Jason, at the IP address of the virtual machine. We'll get this little message that says, hey, this is a new machine, I don't recognize this key, so are you sure this is safe? And since we've just set it up ourselves, we can be pretty sure that this is going to be a safe thing to connect to. So we'll type yes, and note that for this question you have to type yes out completely, so YES, then enter, and we'll go ahead and be asked for our password. We'll type that in, and then we'll be in a secure shell session to our virtual machine. Now by doing this, I can actually minimize my virtual machine window and just interact with my virtual machine through my host terminal. And this can be handy because maybe I want to run several virtual machines. I can actually administer them and interact with them through my host terminal, just as I would with physical systems that are not physically right here where I can get at them. And so the experience is more like what you're going to get with physical systems that might be distributed all over the building or all over the world. Now, let's also notice that the system is telling me that it requires a reboot, so we can do that right here from our host terminal. We'll issue the sudo reboot command, and that will reboot our virtual machine. Once that's done rebooting, we can go ahead and reconnect from our host terminal and just do everything that we would want to do with this fresh new virtual machine that we've just built from scratch. And once we're done doing whatever we're doing with our virtual machine, we can go ahead and issue the exit command to close our secure shell session and log out of the system.